are joining this event, which we organize with a great pleasure, with great speakers, and I dare to say with an all-star panel featuring, to start with, Jana Puglierin, the head of Berlin Office of the European Council on Foreign Relations and Senior Policy Fellow at the CFR. Hello, Jana, very good to have you.
Morning.
We have also François Heisbourg, Senior Advisor at the Institute for International and Security Studies in London and Fondation de Recherche Stratégique in Paris, a renowned expert in defense and security policy, representing France here, not the French government, but France in this discussion. And last but definitely not least, Radosław Sikorski, at the moment, member of the European Parliament, in the past, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Defense, also the president of the Speaker of the Polish Parliament, and also having many other important positions in the past. I'm very glad to have you all. And the topic we are going to discuss is the strategic compass, the EU defense looking for a strategic compass. And the strategic compass is for those who are not versed in all those acronyms and terms closely associated with European security and defense policy. Strategic compass is not an ECFR invention. It's not a term we invented for the sake of this event, but this is an important political process going on at the moment in the European Union, a sort of a review of the security and defense policy of the EU, and indeed an attempt to find or to define for the European security and defense policy at times where European stronger contribution to its own security is becoming a more and more urgent task. And the strategic compass initiated under the German EU presidency last year is designed to give a greater coherence and a greater political clout to the EU as a crisis manager and partner also for other institutions, other countries when it comes to security policy. And the goal is to make the European Union fit for purpose as a security policy actor. But not only those who are experts in the field know that this is by far not the first attempt of the European Union to enhance its capabilities and its cohesion as a security policy actor. We, a couple of years ago, we witnessed the establishment of enhanced cooperation in the realm of security defense, known under the acronym PESCO. We know also vaguely that there is something like European battle groups, so military units under the sort of supervision of the European Union. And there were many attempts to make the European Union a more active and a more engaged security policy actor. But to be honest, the probably quite a widespread impression is that those attempts have not been particularly successful, and the record of them is not really very encouraging. So the first question which I would like to ask my panelists to kick off this conversation is why actually this time it could be different. Is there really a new momentum for EU security and defense policy? Do we see a qualitative change in the approach of the EU member states to this particular policy, or are we going to face a similar sort of disappointment this time, like in the previous years? And maybe I would like Jana to try to answer this this question and then we will move to our other speakers. Jana.
So as a good German, I have to give a positive answer here, because the strategic compass is also a brainchild of the German Council presidency. It was initiated, I think, by the Germans, and then the Germans tried to convince the French to be on board, and the French agreed because they basically can conclude the whole exercise and have the final word during their Council presidency. So this was hugely supported, or is hugely supported by the German government. And I think there is reason that this will not end up, to hope that this will not end up as just another paper tiger. And I see basically three. The first one is that, I mean, it's not about huge leaps forward. It's not about a complete game changer, but I think there is this momentum still ongoing in European defense that started basically with Brexit and then the election of Donald Trump. And when all these initiatives, the acronym soup we refer to, or you refer to, Piotr, in your introductory remarks, was basically born, kind of the idea that Europeans do more together, become a more credible actor also in the military sphere. And then when kind of PESCO was developed, the European Defence Fund, and all these initiatives. And I think there is still some of this momentum left, even though a lot of Europeans might now think that with the election of Joe Biden, we can all go back to sleep and there is not really a necessity to do this. I think from the conversations I'm having all over Europe, I have the impression that people know that this is false hope and that pressure on the Europeans to do more will be mounting and not decreasing. And so now with the American president, and this is why I think that this can be successful, we have someone in the White House who is supportive of these European efforts, who basically even asked or applied to join a PESCO project on military mobility as the United States, as a partner. And so I think this is something that could really be beneficial for the whole process. We have someone in the White House who supports this. Then I think because we have this support and because we have the need, I think there are two basic processes going on. It's the strategic compass process in the EU, but at the same time, a strategic concept process in NATO. And I think there is a desire from both organizations to closely link these initiatives. So I think the strategic compass can serve as a way to contribute to fairer burden sharing within the transatlantic alliance. And I think it's a unique opportunity to ensure complementarity. So these are the 3 points. First of all, I think there is the realization that the Europeans need to do more. And I think if we don't want to end up with technocratic acronyms like PESCO, EDF, and CARD, we need a document that gives strategic direction. Second, because we have someone in the White House who supports this. And third, because we have also a process within NATO. And I think that could make the whole thing more coherent. And last word, so the trick for me is to make this really relevant is that this is not another abstract concept, the compass, but this gives concrete recommendations, that it actually does what it says it wants to do, to bridge or to close the gap between the huge rhetoric the EU always has about strategic autonomy or European sovereignty and the little action that it produces. And I think if the compass manages to reduce this gap by offering concrete recommendations, in the 4 baskets we will talk about later, but by saying what concretely needs to be done, then I think this compass can be a success and can contribute to making us more capable in the world.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana, for these optimistic words. And I think we will come back to a few questions you have already raised, also NATO and the position of the new American administration towards the ambitions of the European Union in the realm of security and defense. But I would like to ask, before we come to the more detailed questions, I would like to ask Mr. Heisbourg if he shares this quite optimistic opinion about the prospects of the current attempt to make the European Union a more credible actor in the realm of security defense, given the fact that we in the last few months even we have observed the European Union rather struggling to respond coherently to a number of challenges in its neighborhoods, be it Libya, be it the Middle East, be it Belarus. Of course, not all of those challenges were of military character, but still, if we struggle to formulate a very strong and coherent foreign policy position, so the question is, is it realistic to expect that we can find a compass for security and defense ambitions, given this rather dire state of the foreign policy? So, Mr. Heisbourg, if you could.
Well, since the responsibility for the whole thing is being handed over to the French presidency in the first half of next year, it can only be a success, n'est-ce pas? No, to be serious, first of all, I'm not sure that there will be much political energy available during the French presidency, given that we'll be in the middle of an electoral campaign. So I wouldn't count too much on momentum on that side. And of course, the Germans will have had their elections, and the new coalition, whatever it is, will take some time to find its own feet. So if things happen, I assume that they'll happen a bit further down the road. Second point, lesson from the past. It was said, I think you said it, Piotr, that previous attempts had not been, on the European side, had not been particularly successful. I would caveat that in the following way. Those operations which were run by the European Union generally actually met their stated objectives, whether it was the genocide prevention operation in Eastern Congo in 2003, whether it was the anti-piracy mission Atalanta, whether it was the Darfur mission, whether it was the Aceh peace mission, and so on. So the good news is that when the European Union is tasked to do something, it can actually do them with some modicum of success. The other news is that a common security and defense policy is narrowly limited in the purposes that it is supposed to achieve. Defense and security, as seen by the European Union in the European treaties, is basically viewed as an extension of EU external policy. It is not about national defense, and it is not about national security, except in the largely virtual and relatively narrowly defined security guarantee clauses in the treaty, which France, for example, invoked after the terror attacks in Paris in 2015. So when you have treaties which essentially prevent you from doing national defense and national security, you're not going to produce national defense and national security. And if something like the strategic compass were to be successful, however you define success, and if a destination were set as a result of having a compass, by the way, does not give you the destination. The compass points you in every single direction, 360 degrees. So the hard work is actually not about building the compass. The hard work is deciding where you want to go and to give yourselves a means to go there. So the jury is completely out. I am not, however, entirely pessimistic first of all, what was said by Jana about the new American administration is true. They are not going to enter, to my understanding, the sort of sniping and undermining exercises which we had 20 years ago when Madeleine Albright was denouncing the British and the French attempt to put together a European defense policy. She invoked the 3Ds, you know, dangerously decoupling, discriminatory, duplicating. This was very harsh language, and it certainly didn't help. The Biden administration is not going to do this. Whether that is actually good news is another question, because one of the reasons, of course, why the Biden administration is not being hostile is because it expects us to pick up where the US is leaving off. And this is not about the French, basically. The French, of course, have their views. They're long-standing, and strategic autonomy has been around forever. I mean, this is not a new theme as far as we're concerned. No, what is changing is the world. The world is marked by the rise of China. This is cramping America's style. It is forcing it into making strategic choices. If you take something like the Mediterranean, where a large number of EU countries have a border, like Greece and Cyprus, for example, vis-à-vis Turkey, the Americans are not playing a lead role anymore. They've ceased to play a lead role since at least 2013 with the Red Line crisis in Syria. So in effect, when things started to get very hot in the Mediterranean last year, early last year, with Turkey flexing its military muscles, the only response came from Europe. It had to come from Europe. And the French felt a bit alone for quite some time, trying to convince the Germans and others that maybe the fact of being a member of the European Union, like Greece and Cyprus, entitled one to some degree of protection. This is what is happening. This is what is changing. Whether the compass is going to play a useful role or not is, once again, an entirely open question. But circumstances have indeed changed. Because circumstances change, the Europeans have to change. We simply cannot afford to continue with the status quo.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like, following up on what you just said, I would like to ask you right away two questions to Mr. Sikorski. The first one is about, because Mr. Sikorski is very familiar with the American foreign policy and security policy thinking. So my question is, how do you read the American position on EU's security and defense ambitions? Because this is, of course, an extremely important factor when it comes to the intra-European discussion. And then perhaps right away, the question about perhaps the most ambitious idea which came up in this discussion in the framework of this strategic compass in the European Union, the idea of a European army, a new one, not a new one. We have heard these proposals many times already, but I could say the joint letter of 14 EU member states, which was published a couple of days ago, suggesting that we should once again try to go into this direction, comes after a report you co-authored for the European Parliament, which advocates basically for the same idea and suggests that the European Union should establish a brigade, which could allow it to perform crisis management operations in its near neighborhood, independently from the US or from other actors. And so my question is, to what extent you think that this European army idea or European Legion idea, as you called it, to what extent it would be a different attempt than the infamous battle groups, which are already there but have never been used because of the lack of consensus among the EU member states. So do you think this idea could really push the European security and defense policy forward more than anything else, or this is just one of the elements of the future design of the European security and defense policy? So these two questions, if I may.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, I think American attitude is twofold. On the more they're engaged and the more they're scared of the competition with China, the more help and the more burden sharing in Europe they will tolerate or encourage. So I think the strategic argument for some European autonomous capability that will make Europe less dependent on the US will be tolerated and even encouraged, moderated by the fear of American companies of losing portions of the Europeans' procurement case. And don't underestimate this factor. They don't believe us that we'll spend more. They fear that they will just get less of it within the same size of the cake. And the solution to this is to say that a Europe that is more serious about defense would spend and buy more, and so everybody would benefit. But also that we need more reciprocity in this field because European companies should have the same access as American companies to each other's defense markets. On the European army, I caution you against using this term because it's like federalism. It produces more disagreement and more heat than light, because most people understand that to mean the joining up of national armies, and that will never happen. And the argument I like to use is that when the US states fought the British in their War of Independence, they didn't join up the state militias. They created a new continental army. There is movement because, we read the newspapers and we know that the US is regarding its competition with China as their main focus, so they might not have the bandwidth or the resources to help us even if they wished. They no longer have the capacity to fight two major wars simultaneously. So Europe sensibly thinks we need to develop an insurance policy of our own. And we have created for the first time in this new multi-annual financial framework a defense budget. It is much smaller than I had hoped for. The pandemic intervened. It was supposed to be 13 billion. That's what the Commission proposed. It is 7, which means 1 billion per annum for a whole continent, which is peanuts. Poland alone spends 11 billion per annum. But it's a good start. And the reason the battle groups have never been used is that the incentives are all wrong. And not only would 3 countries have to agree simultaneously, they would have to pay for the mission as well. Which is why with others, and I see some of them among attendees, I have proposed the concept of a European Legion, which would be a brigade-size unit, but paid for from the common budget. So that flips the incentives. If you don't participate, at least you're paying for it. And it would not be composed of national subunits, but of volunteers from member states. And I think we have a much lower threshold on sending volunteers. And thirdly, it would be under the authority of the Foreign Affairs Council. This is, I feel, gaining traction. I have proposed these ideas and a couple more in the process of the Conference for the Future of Europe, which has already started. And they all have been approved initially into the EPP draft for the conference. And it's now official EPP policy to support this, to support the European Legion, to support the creation of a defense commissioner and a defense council and a joint headquarters. Now, this is just EPP initial proposal. Not all EPP parties have yet spoken. This may be modified, and of course, EPP is the largest, but doesn't have an overall majority. But I was encouraged by the discussion that we had. Some people wanted to go much further. So this is actually now mainstream, at least in EPP. I think fueled by the fact that A, the British have left and they've always been against, and B, the people of Europe are scared of what might happen in Libya or Algeria and are actually demanding it, demanding protection from the unknown. The unknown in the form of a pandemic has happened and caught us unprepared. And defense is the same thing, really. It's an insurance policy against something that we don't wish for, but which might unfortunately happen. So I think the climate for it is better than in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Jana, a question for you. I mean, following up what has just been said, you know, this idea of a European brigade, it sounds actually quite attractive. You can imagine, you know, there is a conflict in Libya or in Syria again or somewhere else, and such a brigade is sent to fight for European interests or to defend.
Secure a Libyan port.
Sorry?
Secure a Libyan port.
Yes, for example.
By Putin's people, for example.
So do you
the Libyan port, which is in the hands of Russia?
Before it falls into Russian hands.
Well, it is already in Russian hands.
So that's I think my question would be: do you think this is the direction in which this discussion about the strategic compass should go to? Is a European brigade a silver bullet for the European defense, or is it rather a detractor from the real issues, as some people say? And before you answer the question, I just wanted to say that whoever would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, the question and answers box. I see that some questions have been already formulated, and I will, of course, ask them to our panelists. So, Jana, please.
Well, when answering this, I refer to the proposal that is on the table by the 14 member states, and that was proposed in within the kind of crisis management basket of the strategic compass. Maybe we need to explain that to listeners that are not so familiar with the strategic compass. So the discussion is organized in 4 so-called baskets. It's about first one is crisis management, second one is resilience, third one is capability development, and fourth one is partnerships. And the idea is within the framework of the compass that we as a European Union, as member states, define what the EU wants to be able of doing in the field of crisis management. So what should be basically the EU's level of ambition? What should the EU be able to do? And also what should the EU not be able to do? So where are the limits? And same with resilience. So what should be in that basket? And then to define which capabilities are needed. And I think this is this is a good structure, and within the crisis management basket, so this big standing brigade was proposed. I think there are basically three big obstacles, especially also from Central and Eastern European concerns. First one is, will it ever be used? And I think Radek Sikorski already mentioned that kind of the current existing battle groups have never been used. And he already explained what are the reasons for this. And so the question that I would have is, how can we make sure that kind of we use this 5,000 kind of people brigade, and how kind of do we make sure that we don't put a lot of effort into this, into building this, because this is, I mean, it's not it doesn't come without any costs or efforts that we kind of that we do this. So is it worth it? Will it be used? That's the first question. And how can we make sure that it will be used? And the second, I think, concern that many people have or think that's an obstacle is that in how far you need bigger EU command structures, and not all member states would be happy to see them. And the third question that I have when it comes to the brigade is also the relationship between kind of this, the concept behind it is very similar to the VGTF concept. So how do these two basically concepts align? How does it relate to the VGTF, to everything we do in NATO? Because it's about it's about readiness, and it's about kind of moving people fast to places. So how can we make sure that we have basically enough people, personnel capabilities, and readiness to ensure this? And these are the questions that I'm having. But I understand the underlying concern, because, I mean, to make EU crisis management more relevant again, I think is highly needed, because so far, I mean, if you look at the current missions that the EU does, so you see a steady decline when it comes to number of people under the EU flag that are sent somewhere, and also the level of the operations. When you kind of look back in the earlier 2000s, kind of the ambition was much higher, and now we basically train and equip. And I think what's behind this is really the effort to make crisis management relevant again, and to make it the platform for European countries to basically cooperate and work together, and also to counter this trend towards kind of coalitions of the willing that pop up outside the EU framework now frequently. And so I understand the idea behind it. It's just, as Radek has said, we need to work on how can we make sure that it will be really used, and that member states have the political will also to send the troops then somewhere.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana. And in your answer, you echoed a number of arguments which have been also made in the chat by our viewers. There are some concrete questions, but our guests point to a number of possible obstacles, like, you know, lack of capabilities, and the fact that a new European army, European brigade, would not basically solve this question. I mean, which seems to be an important argument for those who are skeptical. That we, for example, Hans Huygens says that we can hardly fill 2 small battle groups, each some 1,500 soldiers. How are we going to incentivize filling the roster for a brigade? But there are also questions about the decision-making process, and the fact that finding a consensus to use such a unit would be extremely difficult. But I don't want our discussion to focus exclusively on the European army idea, but this is very much related to Mr. Heisbourg. Of course, you will have the opportunity to answer to that. I just wanted to, before I give you the floor, to also cite the question posed by Marcin Telikowski from Peace, from the Polish think tank, who asks about the relationship between the EU potential army, but I would also broaden this scope to the EU security and defense ambitions at large, and NATO. I would even formulate it this way: is there a trade-off between the development of a coherent EU strategic autonomy in the realm of security and defense and NATO? Is it because I think this is indeed a worry concern in such, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, that this EU integration in the realm of security defense would go at the expense of NATO and not support the transatlantic security. So, Mr. Heisbourg, maybe if you could slightly broaden this answer to the European army question to also including this.
I'd be happy to do that. First of all, I agree entirely with Radek when he says that we should not use or abuse the expression European army. It creates heat. That indeed was Macron's intention when he used the expression the day before Trump came to Paris in 2018. It was designed to create heat, and it certainly did. But it should not be put at the level of a fleshed-in, practical diplomatic proposal. Second point, European brigade. The French and the Germans have had a joint brigade for about 25 years now. There's no lack of manpower. There's no lack of capability. When we have to go to Mali, we find the troops to go to Mali. When we need to do something somewhere, we somehow manage to do it. Why do we have trouble with battle groups? Because the battle groups are simply not politically and strategically useful. And therefore, apart from the satisfaction of ticking a box, it makes no sense to invest military and political energy in investing in the so-called battle groups, which have never seen battles and which are not much of a group. The same fate will await the brigade. And the French-German brigade has actually seen a little bit of command responsibility I think it was in Macedonia or Kosovo some 20 years ago. But what was true, Radek, when you gave your speech in Munich 10 years ago, when you said that German inaction is scarier than Germans in action, that remains true. And you're not going to resolve that problem by creating another French-German brigade with a number of other EU countries added onto it. That is what will happen.
It wouldn't be with countries. It would be from volunteers from all over Europe.
No, sure, but Germany is still a member of the European Union. And sure. I suspect it will have some voice in entering into an enterprise like seizing Manu Militari, a Syrian port, under the gaze of the Russian armed forces. I don't think that Germany is ready for this, and I don't think most other EU countries are ready for it, actually. So it's a nice idea. It's the sort of idea which the French usually love. We have great experience with brigades. We actually have checked and ticked all of the boxes for the battle groups, except that when we had a contingency in Mali, and when you remember, the battle group which was on rota at the time of the Mali intervention was the French-Polish battle group. We did not use it. Why did we not use it? Because it would have been an enormous complication in a very fast-moving military situation, and the timeline of a political decision plus complications in the command organization would have made it close to impossible to prevent the fall of Bamako, the capital of Mali, into the hands of the jihadis. This is, defense is an enormous, as you know, is an enormously serious affair. And creating another brigade.
That's why it should be a standing unit.
Well, sure, okay, it's a standing unit which will remain sitting on its seat because the European Union is not a federal state. It is not the United States of America. And that's the reality of the situation, however much I personally deplore it. You know, I'm like Robert Schuman, half of me comes from Luxembourg. If there were a federal Europe, I would be one of its great supporters. But it is not what we have, and it's not what we're going to get anytime soon, alas. On the broader issue, NATO, EU, and strategic autonomy. This is very interesting. We had in 2011 a war, a real war. I mean, it's always interesting when we talk about defense to talk about real wars, not about things that we put in the strategic compass. We had a war in Libya. We needed command arrangements. I agree with you that it would actually have made sense for the European Union to have had its own command structure. Old French idea, rebutted for a long time by most EU members and the United States of America. It would have made sense, but it didn't exist. So what happened? We actually hijacked the NATO command structure. The US had signaled that it no longer wanted to run the operation in Libya after about a week of operations, that it was no longer going to commit frontline assets. And therefore, essentially the Americans were telling us, you're on your own, but if you want to work through NATO, it's no problem with us. And after some reflection, the Brits and the French, who were the lead nations in this affair, decided, yeah, well, after all, yeah, let's just use NATO as if it were a PESCO. We turned NATO's command assets into a tool of the policy of the 12 EU/NATO countries which supported the operations in Libya and which participated in those operations. This was,
and a great success it's proven to be.
No, wait a second. We can debate however long we want the successes and the failures of this or that war. But where it is not possible to state that what didn't happen, didn't happen. It did happen. There was a war, and there were command arrangements, and they were handled through NATO apparatus by European countries. Did this cause great problems with the Americans? No, it didn't. Did the Americans punish Europe for having done this? Of course not. And the Biden administration is not going to punish Europe for practicing what the French called strategic autonomy, which is an ambiguous concept which lends itself to all sorts of misunderstandings. That I can only confirm. But the fact of the matter is that strategic autonomy is about the ability to choose of one's own sovereign, through one's own sovereign means, the framework in which you are going to run a military operation. That's strategic autonomy. You can decide whether you're going to run an EU flagged operation, an ad hoc operation, a NATO flagged operation, or something in between, like we had in Libya. This is what strategic autonomy is about. It's not a tool against the Americans, and it shouldn't be. I mean, if that is the perception which takes hold in the US or in various EU countries, then that would be a catastrophe. But strategic autonomy, I think, is actually quite a useful concept if it means that it gives us the framework in which to exercise the politically, strategically, and militarily most appropriate or least inappropriate decision in terms of the framework in which we operate. And of course, always a reminder, the bulk of military forces in European countries are what they are. And NATO, for example, never had, with the limited but strategically important exception of the Allied mobile force in the old days, and more recently I always forget the acronym, it was mentioned earlier on, the projection force. But the bulk of NATO military assets were not NATO military assets. The bulk of NATO's military assets have always been national assets, which have been put into, which have been earmarked for assignment, to use the Cold War language, were earmarked for assignment to NATO if the North Atlantic Council, composed of sovereign nations, decided to do this. There never was a NATO army. And for the same reason, there's not going to be, and I come back to my initial agreement with Rade, there's not going to be a European army as long as we don't have a United States of Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Heisbourg. And I would like to shift our discussion a little bit to two questions which have been raised by numerous guests in the chat. And the first one is, I think you have all touched upon it, but I think it would be worth discussing it a little bit more depth. This is the question of the level of ambitions, of military ambitions the EU should have. So if whatever we can imagine as a EU military force, be it battle groups or a European army or whatever other composition of national forces. So the key question is, what do we need it for, actually? And do we want, what kind of military operations or crisis management operations do we want to perform with the help of these forces? At the moment, the CSDP missions have been mostly about training, education, or whatever. So the level of ambition has not been extremely high, at least in the last few years. So the question is, what should we basically aim for? And the second question, which has been raised by I think by Thierry Tardy and few other people in the chat, is about the decision-making mechanism. So since the European consensus on deployment of European troops of whatever character is rather not in sight, so the question is, to what extent these kind of missions could be performed by coalitions of the willing, or perhaps a sort of European Security Council composed by a few larger EU member states could play a central role. So how do you envisage, basically the practicing of security defense operations of the European Union? So perhaps starting with Radek Sikorski.
I agree with you that there is no clarity because we are not sufficiently scared. What Russia is doing around Ukraine, or the largest mobilization of forces in several decades, and clearly a dress rehearsal for a possible operation to dismember Ukraine. The Zapad exercises, and so far it's seen that that's a NATO job, and that NATO, particularly with the change of US leadership, will be there to deal with that. And in the South, people still don't imagine what might happen if Libya collapses or Algeria blows. And my worry is that when that happens, it will be too late to do anything about it, because, as François was saying, these things take a long time to prepare. So I believe this is conceivable, and therefore we should be ready. But, we are a group of peaceful, somewhat lethargic nations, and we do things only when it's almost too late. We started fixing the euro when it was almost too late. But in this case, we might pay very dearly for it. I believe in events, dear boy. We will get serious on defense when we are seriously threatened. But will there be enough time to reconfigure when that happens? I doubt it.
And what about the decision-making process? Do you believe rather in a consensus-based common European action, or rather coalitions of the willing? But in that case, in the latter case, what would be the political cost to that?
Well, look, I originally formulated with Bernard Kouchner, the Foreign Minister of France, actually at my house in Poland, the original letter to, at that time, Lady Ashton, to launch PESCO as an elite project, as an avant-garde project of countries that really wanted to get serious about this, that were willing to synchronize their rules of engagement, that were willing to put their troops truly under a joint command, and that were willing to commit the resources. This has now been transmogrified into a project for everyone, even by countries who are, quite frankly, not serious about defense, which means that we are into the classic EU quagmire of a convoy proceeding at the pace of the slowest ship. And I think most successful EU projects were done by avant-garde groups. So I think it was a mistake. But the European Legion concept, particularly if combined with qualified majority voting in the Foreign Affairs Council, solves this issue. Because it's composed of volunteers. Member states would not be commanding their own citizens. It's funded by the EU, and it's authorized by Brussels. And it would be the fulfillment of the Lisbon Treaty, by the way. The Lisbon Treaty is much more ambitious than what we are actually doing. And arguably, we used to be far more ambitious. At the time of the Balkans, there was talk of 30,000, 40,000 troops at the ready. And we are now saying that one brigade is, maybe too ambitious. Come on. And I think we should do it before we are again surprised by a sort of knowable unknown.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then moving to Jana, you certainly would like to come in on several questions which have been raised, but I will also dare to ask you one more. And because the elephant in the room is of course Germany, expecting general election in the autumn, and so the question is what can we expect from Germany post Merkel when it comes to its contribution to European security and defense policy? And this question has been raised also by our guests in the chat, and especially I think, of course, the question is very much about the Greens, who are most likely to join the next government. And the Greens are known for their very strong pro-European positions, but they are at the same time known for the rather skeptical views on the role of military. So how these sentiments will play out in the post-Merkel security and defense policy in the European context?
I think we should once organize a whole seminar about the future of German defense policy, because I think this is a very, very intense conversation that we need to have here. But maybe I want to say something on the EU's level of ambition. I think when we look at crisis management and this whole debate, I think this compass now really kind of poses the question to us: what do we really want to be able to do? And of course, we are not alone in the world. We need to define this in close relationship to what NATO wants to do, looking at crisis management. And arguably, NATO's appetite for crisis management operations is very limited. But that is also true, I think, for us more broadly. I mean, nobody is particularly eager to, for military interventions. And I think precisely because of the experience in Afghanistan, but also lately in Mali, in the Sahel more broadly. So I think that is something we need to take into account. So we have basically crisis management as a basket. We need to fill it. We need to look what does NATO want to do in that regard, and where could the EU add value. And we used to say, okay, this is here the EU, this is the EU's field of action, its neighborhood and all that. But at the same time, I think we have to really kind of see that our appetite for military intervention is also low. Some people, including, for example, Thierry Tardy, who is in that call, have made the case for let kind of the high intensity stuff being done by NATO, and let the EU concentrate on what the EU is really best at, that is more low intensity, and that is maybe also more the non-military stuff. And you can make this argument, and I think there is a lot of truth to this, but then you can make the counter argument and can say, yeah, but the problem is that if NATO doesn't have really an appetite any longer, and maybe the EU should be more ambitious than just training and equipping partners, which is sometimes also not that successful, as we see now in Mali, and leave kind of the fighting terrorist part to coalitions of the willing. Usually the French always say, we kill the terrorists, and you Germans, you do the training and the equipping within the EU framework. And this is also not sustainable. So I think the member states need to have a debate what they really want to include in that basket. A German position would be that we want crisis management to be more ambitious and more flexible, especially for one reason, because for Germans, this increasing trend in Europe for more coalitions of the willing is difficult legally, because of a ruling of our constitutional court in the mid-90s, maybe that goes too far here, but if we send soldiers abroad, that needs to happen in a framework of collective security, in a NATO framework, in an EU framework, in an EU framework. And so for the Germans, it's really important to make crisis management more effective and also more flexible. And that brings me to decision making. I have really not much hope for QMV and the Foreign Affairs Council. We did a study last year in those member states, and really half of the EU is just not really happy to see QMV in foreign and let alone security and defense policy. So what the Germans are, I think, looking into or trying to push is to make the EU level more flexible. For example, activating Article 44 for the first time, and look at how can we basically have coalitions of the willing inside an EU framework. But that requires unanimity in the Council in the first place, and then more flexibility within this group. But that is the discussions that the Germans would like to see. So I think an honest assessment, coming back to what I said initially, kind of what is the huge rhetoric we always have in the EU and what can we concretely do. I think we need to look at what are we willing to do in terms of crisis management. I mean, we have serious shortfalls when it comes to capabilities, especially high-end capabilities. So can we even do high-intensity operations on our own in an EU framework? We need to discuss the geographical reach, where do we want to be active, and all this in the basket. But as I said, the Germans would like to be more ambitious and more flexible within the EU framework in order to prevent the EU framework from being just marginal, and the NATO framework, and just to avoid the coalitions of the willing. And that brings me to the Greens, because that is one thing that they have made very clear in their Grundsatzprogramm and in their election program, where they said that they don't want Germany to join coalitions of the willing. They see them as not in line with our constitution, and they are strongly against this. So we will see more debates, especially with the French, when we have these questions like Strait of Hormuz or Operation Takuba. I think the Greens will be everything but eager to join these coalitions, and they will try to prevent them from happening. But in general, I would think that the Greens also have a huge sense of responsibility. They have emphasized the responsibility to protect in their election program, and there is kind of this tension within the party program. So I would not say that if the Greens join or even lead the German government, that the situation with the Germans will be worse than what we are seeing now, to the contrary. But I think on the question of crisis management and coalitions of the willing, that is a difficult topic for the Greens in particular.
Thank you very much, Jana. And Mr. Heisbourg, I would love to hear your view on Germany as well, because it's of course a key question. To what extent France and other countries can count on the future German government. And so one question to you would be about the expectations toward Germany, but I would also like to open yet another box. I don't want to say a Pandora box, but talking about EU defense, you can hardly avoid the really hardest security issue, which is the nuclear. And a year ago, President Macron offered to sort of maybe not open the nuclear umbrella of France for other EU member states, but invited other member states to participate in exercises and nuclear exercises, and sort of open this discussion about how to use the French nuclear shield as a security instrument for the whole European Union. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the response has not been particularly vivid across Europe. And so my question is, what would be how could that work? And is it still in the cards? Is it an option also, something which should be followed by other countries? Would it bring the European defense to another level? Would it be a significant change? And how do you see that?
Sure. First of all, on Germany, Radek reminded us earlier on that in the all EU convoy, it's the slowest ship which determines the speed of the convoy. In matters of defense, in matters of crisis involvement, engagement, the slowest ship is also the biggest ship, and it happens to be Germany. And that is unfortunately indeed what made PESCO into the rather flabby and basically useless thing that it has become. The French tried quite hard, including under Macron. They picked up on what you had done, Radek, with Bernard Kouchner. That is, the French actually tried quite hard to make an avant-garde, but there was no way. Berlin dug in its heels and wanted to be inclusive. And so we got an inclusive PESCO, which cannot do the sort of stuff which you were suggesting. On Germany, there are high hopes in Paris, paradoxically, vis-a-vis green membership or even leadership in the future coalition. Why high hopes? Well, first of all, because the Greens have been working very hard. And I saw this when I was a fellow at the Bosch Academy in Berlin a few years ago. They've been working very, very hard, preparing themselves, including on defense issues, for government. They know their dossier. They know their files. There will be lots of disagreements between Paris and Berlin with the Greens, but there will be informed disagreements. There will be a real discussion of the sort that we haven't really had over the last 15 years, or even more. And this is in itself good news. That is, there will be the relationship, instead of being relatively indifferent and marked by inertia, may become much more dynamic, may also be a bit loud at times. I would also add that the coalition of the willing issue is acute only because of what Radek mentioned. That is, if the convoy is too slow because the slowest ship is too slow, you can't use the EU. But if the slowest ship decides to speed up, the way, let's say, Germany sped up during the Kosovo crisis, with Joschka Fischer, the Green foreign minister, in the lead, well, then you don't actually need a coalition of the willing, because you do it through a constituted body. In the case of Kosovo, it was NATO. In Sahel, it could be the European Union, quite possible. So I actually look forward to that that discussion between the French and the Germans, and both the French and the Germans will be talking from a similar timeline in terms of political mobility. That is, if Macron is elected, which I think is the most likely outcome, he will be around for another 5 years, and the German coalition presumably will be around for at least 4 years. So there's time to work together. The calendar will be in sync. That's good news. The nuclear stuff. When talking about nuclear commitments vis-a-vis non-nuclear countries, extended deterrence, as it's called, you have to deal with three audiences. One audience is the audience of the country which provides deterrence, which may decide to extend or not extend deterrence. In this case, in the, what was in your question was in the case of France. That's the easy audience, paradoxically. The French, there was no criticism from any quarter of the Macron speech of February of last year on this score. The French, first of all, tend to trust their government, rightly or wrongly, but they tend to trust their government on matters of defense, including in the nuclear aspect. That helps. And there's also maybe a sense of sort of pride that we could play a bigger role. That's France, I don't think, will be the problem of this one. Then you have a second member of the audience, which we sometimes forget. But of course, Poles never forget it, and they're right not to forget it. And I agree with everything that Radek said about Ukraine and so on. And that, of course, is the country against which we deter, the deterree, if I can call it that is Russia. Would French extended deterrence be credible? That's a serious question. It's a difficult question. And the answer may well be that for it to be seen as credible by Moscow, one would have to change the French nuclear posture in quantitative and in qualitative terms, because we have had a policy which has stressed over the decades the minimalist nature of our nuclear force structure, designed to deal with fairly narrow, geographically fairly narrow contingencies. And of course, for the deterree to believe that the same force, which has been tailored to do a relatively small job, to be able to do a much bigger job, would probably not be credible. So that would mean changes in the force structure. That would be difficult, but far from impossible, in the sense that we are in France entering into a cycle of nuclear modernization. And if that were undertaken to some extent in consultation with our European partners, the force structure could evolve correspondingly. I think here, for example, of the work we're doing on hypervelocity vehicles. It's not only the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans who do this. We are going to do a test flight in a number of months of our first hypersonic vehicle. This thing is actually pretty much open. And then, of course, you have the third audience, and that is the people to whom you are suggesting that deterrence could maybe be extended. And here, well, first of all, the response has been far from enthusiastic, but it hasn't been negative. We haven't had the same form of embarrassment, notably in Germany, but also elsewhere, which we had in 1995, when the French made a similar suggestion, and when Alain Juppé, I think, was prime minister. Dissuasion concertée, I think it was called. The sense of embarrassment amongst our partners was very, very unpleasant. This time, they are careful, they're prudent, they don't want to upset the Americans, and that's perfectly normal. They're not sure what this would be like. They want to touch this, they want to smell this, they want to see this, and take their time. And this is perfectly normal. And so the French, the president suggested that those countries which would be interested should be able to join the biannual nuclear maneuvers that we hold. We're like the Russians in this sense. We take nuclear things very, very seriously, and we train for them. We don't deal with this as a purely intellectual force, I can put it that way. It's not simply a deterrence theory force. It is an actual force. So for them to see and understand what the doctrine is, what the means are, the capabilities, and so on, this may take time, fine. Is this incompatible with nuclear arrangements in NATO? No, it isn't. The French are more than happy to see the Americans pursue the dual key nuclear arrangements with those countries which have American nuclear weapons in their inventory. And they're very quite happy to continue to see integrated NATO countries, members of the nuclear planning group, participate, as Poland does, for example, in the non-nuclear aspects of the nuclear missions which NATO would undertake in case of a major war with Russia. But I emphasize the last point, precisely because nuclear affairs are serious. This cannot happen without the countries which could be the beneficiaries of deterrence taking an active part in thinking this through with us and with their partners, the other partners. And this is very difficult. It's very difficult, for example, to have a public debate, public political debate in Germany on nuclear weapons without it fizzling out at best or becoming very nasty at worst. And this is this third aspect, the attitude of the deterree of the countries for which deterrence would be extended, which poses the biggest problem. But I expect this to be on the French table in a permanent manner, as long as we have a rational and reasonable president, and actually quite independently of whether that president would be Macron or somebody from the mainstream right or the mainstream left. So yeah, it's there.
Yeah, thank you. And then before I give the floor to Radek Sikorski, Jana wanted to have a two fingers intervention, I think, on the German part of Mr. Heisbourg.
Yeah, just for the record, I need to oppose this, that Germany is always basically the slowest ship and not kind of helpful in advancing European defense. I think there are several issues between the Germans and the French, and this is sometimes a very toxic dynamic. I would put it like that, but I think there was also a lot of support within the EU from other countries for this inclusive PESCO approach, which felt countries that felt much closer to the German approach than to the French approach. And I think the Germans, I mean, you can criticize this idea to keep the EU together and to make the EU more relevant as an actor, because maybe it's always too slow and too little too late. But I think in a time when basically multilateral institutions are under attack by everybody, I don't know if kind of fizzling out of the organization helps. So I just wanted to be a good German again, like in the beginning, and say it's, I mean, the Germans have also been very constructive. And what is certainly true is that for the Germans, NATO remains the backbone of European defense and not the EU. So what the Germans basically try to do is to make everything we do in NATO and everything we do in the EU complementary, and to make sure that all we do in the EU strategic compass is also beneficial for NATO. And just if I made one last word on the Greens, because I think I'm looking forward to this actually personally. This is my very personal opinion. And you can say that they are very hawkish when it comes to China and Russia, but just to maybe pour a bit water into the wine when it comes to EU defense, the Greens particularly have, as I said, their unique ideas about conditions for missions, but also when it comes to arms export of things that are developed together, when it comes to new technologies, like for example, FCAS, kind of the idea of drones, for example, very difficult. And also when we remember the Greens and the history of, I mean, there's always a huge emphasis on the EU pillar, but they were hugely against the peace facility, for example. They were very critical when it came to the EDF, to the Eurodrone, and everything that I consider a huge step forward. So the Greens were not exactly huge fans. So just because I know that there is this enthusiasm all over Europe that the Germans then all of a sudden, I don't know, gain new speed and new ambition, but just be careful what you wish for. I mean.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. And I'm turning to Radek Sikorski with, I think, a very important question, which was also raised in the chat about also Poland's contribution to the EU defense. To what extent, Poland or other countries of Central Eastern Europe are really genuinely interested in strengthening ambitions or raising ambitions of the EU security and defense policy, which brings me to, I think, to a even more fundamental question about to what extent this ambition to strengthen the EU security policy will ultimately increase the coherence or cohesion of the European Union, or perhaps rather weaken it. Because as long as the EU has not been very ambitious in the realm of security and defense policy, we had a sort of a consensus on a very, very low level. At the moment where we are looking for a strategic compass, for a new destination, for more ambitious, I think all those questions about the nuclear shield, about the relations between the EU and NATO, transatlantic link, and so on and so forth, they are coming to the fore, and my sense is that they are quite divisive. So what is your take on that?
They are divisive if they are unsuccessful. If we deploy some capability and we lose the battle, then it becomes controversial. But if we win, then it becomes unifying, and then there would be public enthusiasm and indeed a contribution to European identity even. On the previous question about PESCO, look, I think it's unserious for countries that are neutral or don't have armies to expect to be taken seriously in the defense councils. Come on. It's like the Czech Republic or Hungary being forceful on maritime policy. When that happens, you know that the process is unserious.
And what do you, perhaps to follow up on the question I've just asked, you know, to press you a little bit on Poland and especially on Poland, and its attitude to the EU defense and security policy. What do you expect, and what do you think should be the Polish level of ambitions when it comes to the EU defense?
Well, we have a particularly provincial and Europhobic government in power now, which, as you remember, invested its all in the alliance, not so much with the United States, but with Donald Trump personally. And they've lost that bet. Before that, the special relationship was supposed to be with Britain, another lost bet. One would hope that the Biden decision, an unfortunate one, to suspend sanctions on Nord Stream would teach them a lesson. That essentially a US president having to choose between the interests of Germany and Russia on the one hand, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Ukraine on the other hand, chooses Germany and Russia. That should make them aware that you can't rely solely on the United States, because you're then becoming a victim of the Washington power game. And that therefore, the re-entry into the G5 of the European Union should be a more attractive proposition. Of course, these are people who don't see beyond the Russian threat and do not feel responsible for the security of the entire EU. Whereas I would see it in the long term as something slightly more complementary, namely, if we help the southern tier with the North Africa problem and we develop capabilities to address that, then at some future point, once we have the capabilities, those capabilities could conceivably be useful in case the American legions leave to fight China. You know, I can imagine that they can't. Poland, I signed up Poland to the Eurocorps. The current government left, and I think Poland was the last to join PESCO. So I don't expect them to be in the lead on any European issue, because they routinely talk about the EU as them. They are mentally not quite inside the EU.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Sikorski. And I'm conscious of the time. We have just 5 minutes to go, and the time is flying, although the conversation is fascinating. And I would like to, as last question, ask all of you about your expectations with regard to this strategic compass process we started our conversation with. So basically, the plan is that this strategic review, or whatever we call it in a sort of simplified way, will come to an end in March 2022, just before the elections in France and under the French presidency. And the discussion will be completed. And so, in your view, what would be the measure of success? Or maybe two questions: what do you expect realistically from this process to deliver? And what would you say is a success, a major leap forward in the CSDP debate, or some small but meaningful steps? So how would you define the success of this process? So maybe Mr. Heisbourg, if I may ask you first.
Sure, thank you. My measure of success, and it's only mine, certainly not the French government. I'm not sure it has made up its own mind as to what it would consider as success. I think the French would be quite happy to see the strategic compass as a rebranding of strategic autonomy, that is, with all of the constituent parts of strategic autonomy, but without necessarily having the heated part of the strategic autonomy debate, and also with the virtue of this being European rather than a French origin operation. That would be a measure of success. I would add as a last word that the European Union should not forget what it is supposed to be already doing just because it has decided to do something new. And that is actually the European Defence Fund and the Military Mobility Initiative. Radek was absolutely right on this matter. This is going to be a big bone of contention with the Americans, but the European interest is very, very clear. And here, the European Union is actually fit for purpose. It knows how to run big programs. It knows how to organize this kind of spending. This is largely about money and organization. And the Commission and the European Defence Agency can do this, provided that the money is there and that the money is available to be spent, and preferably front-loaded rather than left off to the last stages of the current budget multi-year program.
Thank you very much. Jana, the same question for you, if you may.
So I will end hopeful. I started hopeful and I'll end hopeful. So I think that the Compass ambition is to close the gap between huge rhetoric and the reality of the little action. And I think that the people that are working on the strategic compass are really eager to force also the member states to come up with some concrete action points, and so that, to me, the compass would be a success if we manage that member states agree on some concrete steps forward, and also to clarify some hard questions. For example, there is a question when we talk about the resilience basket. So what about territorial defense? What does protection of the Union mean? And how does that relate to NATO? These are hard questions, very difficult for the member states to have. But I think if we have them, and if we reach some consensus here, I think we will have already achieved something. For example, that, I don't know, capability, or how we can link capability development in the EU to NATO better. These things. I see, I see a huge potential when it comes to tangible results, when it comes to clarifying hard questions or issues. Also, I think there is the potential in the partnerships basket. As I said, EU, NATO, but also EU, United States, and how we can kind of stop this inflation of strategic partnerships that the EU has with everybody, but maybe be more concrete and also more hierarchical in our partnerships approach. This is, I think, something that will be really beneficial. And I think in order to make the strategic compass a success, and in order to allow it to really give a strategic direction to the technocratical initiatives, we need the buy-in of the member states. And I think this is the most important part for me, because Piotr, you mentioned in the beginning the EU's global strategy, but I think that the member states never really kind of embrace this dearly. So I think memberships buy in, that they take it seriously, and that they see it as a huge opportunity, which it actually is. I mean, it's not a silver bullet. It will not kind of catapult the EU it will not make the EU kind of the most active and most credible defense actor ever, but it can contribute to making us a better partner to the United States, but also a more credible defense actor in our own right. And I think here is hope and potential.
Thank you very much, Jana. And the last word for Radek Sikorski. So, do you expect the idea of the European Army to be picked up by the EU member states in the framework of this strategic compact discussion, or would you envisage a different outcome?
Well, as I've said before, I think using the words European army is unhelpful. But signs of progress would be if we did the review of the current PESCO projects, not a single one of which has yet borne any fruit. And if they cut the half that is least promising, then I would believe, oh, that some little interests are being overridden by higher considerations. And number two, if the Commission does what it promises, which is to increase the defense portfolio within the annual budgets, so that at least we contribute to NATO mobility, which everybody agrees is good for Europe and for NATO. That would be progress.
Yes, thank you very much. Our time has come to an end. I think it has been a really great discussion. I would like to thank very warmly our great panelists. And I also need to apologize for not having been able to pick up all the questions, very good questions, which were posted in the chat. But I'm sure we will get back to this discussion, and as Jana suggested, there will be also upcoming events organized by ECFR, not only by ECFR Warsaw office, like in this case, but also by ECFR Berlin and other offices, also related to security defense policy in the context of the upcoming German election, and perhaps indeed a seminar or conference or public event on the green defense policy would definitely make sense, because as we have seen, it meets a lot of interest. With that, I would like to thank not only the panelists, but also the whole audience and the interpreters who did a great job. And I wish you a pleasant day, and please attend next events of ECFR. You will find the links on our website. Thank you very much for today, and all the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.